The winter air of Petrograd tasted of ash and silence. Church bells tolled across the frozen city. As a carriage rolled slowly through the snow, its wheels cracking the brittle ice. Inside sat a man who had once ruled 1/6 of the earth. His eyes, weary, uncertain, gazed out at the grey dawn. Nicholas Romanov did not yet know that he would never see another sunrise as emperor. The empire he inherited was dying, not with explosions or parades, but with whispers and with silence. If you believe that history's echoes still speak through the silence of fallen empires, stay with us. The story of the Romanovs begins not with triumph, but with ruin. The year was 1613. Russia lay in ashes, a kingdom without a king, a people without a voice. The time of troubles had left the land hollowed by famine, invasion, and despair. Villages were burned, thrones contested, and men turned against one another for scraps of bread and moments of power. Snow fell upon empty streets where the cries of the dying had long faded, and wolves prowled through the outskirts of Moscow, feeding on what humanity had left behind. In that darkness something stirred. Not hope exactly, but the memory of it. The Russian soul, scarred and silent, began to whisper again, "We must endure." Inside a dim wooden monastery in Kostroma, monks prayed for deliverance. Their chants rose like smoke into the rafters, curling between beams blackened by years of candle soot. Among them knelt a boy, pale, solemn, and trembling. His name was Mikhail Fyodorovich Romanov, and though he could not have known it, history had already chosen him. They came for him at dawn. Outside the monastery gates, horsemen in furs and iron breastplates stamped the frost from their boots. Their torches flickered against the snow as they called out for the boy and his mother. "By the will of the people," one shouted, "and by the voice of God we summon Mikhail Fyodorovich Romanov to the throne of Russia." Mikhail's mother Marfa, a stern and weary woman, refused to open the door. "My son is but a child," she cried. "He knows nothing of kings and crowns. Leave us in peace." But there was no peace left in Russia. For months the Zemsky Sobor, the National Assembly of nobles, clergy, and peasants, had searched for a new Tsar. The throne was cursed. Pretenders had risen and fallen. Foreign princes had claimed and lost it. The people longed for stability, for someone who might heal the bleeding nation. And so their eyes turned to the Romanovs, distant kin of the old dynasty, untainted by ambition, untouched by scandal. When Mikhail finally appeared at the monastery gate, his breath shivered in the cold air. He was barely 16, with a boy's face and a soldier's destiny. As the envoys bowed before him, the snow began to fall heavier, muffling the world in silence. One chronicler would later write, "It seemed that heaven itself held its breath." They brought him to Moscow in a wooden sled lined with fur. Along the roads, peasants knelt in the snow as he passed. They crossed themselves, whispering blessings not for the boy, but for what he represented, a fragile promise of order. When Mikhail entered the Kremlin, the cathedrals stood half empty and the bells rang hollow. The city was a ghost of its former self. Burned towers still smoked in the distance, and inside the palace, walls cracked with frost. On the day of his coronation, February 21st, 1613, the boy king stood before the altar of the Dormition Cathedral. The crown, heavy with rubies and pearls, glimmered under candlelight as priests intoned ancient prayers. "By the grace of God," they declared, "Tsar Mikhail Fyodorovich, sovereign of all Russia." Witnesses said he wept as the crown touched his head. Outside, the wind carried the sound of those tears across the square, the birth cry of a dynasty that would rule for 3 centuries. Yet Mikhail's reign began not in triumph, but in fear. Russia was still surrounded by enemies. The Polish armies lingered in the west, the Swedes to the north, and within the borders, rebellion smoldered like hidden embers. The treasury was empty, the soldiers were unpaid. Even the Kremlin's kitchens had run out of salt. At night Mikhail would walk the corridors of the palace, the echo of his steps mingling with the moans of the wounded outside. He was too young to command, too kind to crush. His mother, wise and severe, ruled beside him, whispering that mercy could rebuild what war had destroyed. But mercy is fragile currency in a land of hunger. One winter evening, as frost thickened on the windows, an advisor knelt before the Tsar. "Your Majesty," he said softly, "the people ask for bread. If they do not receive it soon, they will take it for themselves." Mikhail looked out at the snow-cloaked city, where smoke curled from the few remaining hearths. "Then we must give what little we have," he murmured. "For an empty stomach has no loyalty." It was this gentleness mistaken for weakness that would define his rule. Where other kings wielded swords, Mikhail wielded endurance. Slowly, painfully, he rebuilt what chaos had consumed. Roads reopened, fields were planted, foreign armies withdrew, and in that fragile peace, the Romanov name began to mean something again. But every peace in Russia is temporary. In the shadows of the new court, rivals whispered, nobles plotted, courtiers schemed, and power began to wrap itself around the young Tsar like smoke. The Romanovs had restored the throne, but the throne had begun to consume them in return. When Mikhail's father, Patriarch Filaret, returned from Polish captivity years later, his arrival changed everything. The Patriarch was not merely a man of faith, he was a king in all but name. Stern, ambitious, and burning with divine conviction, Filaret ruled beside his son, forging treaties, raising armies, and enforcing the authority of the new dynasty with iron certainty. Together father and son became two halves of a single will, one holy, one mortal. Under their reign, Russia stabilized, but it also hardened. Loyalty became law, and faith became politics. By the time Mikhail's beard had turned grey, the wounds of the past had begun to close. Churches gleamed again, merchants filled the marketplaces, and the Kremlin towers were gilded anew. Russia, vast and scarred, began to believe in itself. Yet something deeper, more dangerous had taken root. The belief that the Tsar was not merely a ruler, but the embodiment of the nation's soul. One monk wrote in his journal, "If the Tsar should fall, the sky itself would fall with him." That idea, sacred and deadly, would one day doom them all. As Mikhail Romanov lay dying in July 1645, the bells of Moscow tolled softly in the distance. His reign had lasted 32 years. Outside his window, the river glowed gold beneath the setting sun, and the people of Russia, peasants, soldiers, priests, whispered prayers for his soul. He had given them peace, but not freedom, order, but not justice. And as his son Alexei prepared to take the throne, the old boy Tsar's final words were recorded by a servant: "Let him rule with mercy, for a crown without mercy is heavier than iron." The servant swore that as the last candle flickered out, the wind carried those words down the Kremlin corridors, a ghostly warning to every Romanov who would follow. The dynasty had begun in silence, born from exhaustion and faith. But beneath that silence, the earth was restless. The seeds of empire had been sown, and with them, the seeds of its ruin. For now Russia slept. But far to the west, new fires were already being lit. Far beyond the Urals, forests sighed beneath centuries of snow. Merchants drove their sledges along frozen rivers toward Moscow, their cargoes of furs and salt shimmering under the pale sun. Each step of recovery under the Romanovs seemed to awaken the sleeping giant that was Russia, a vast organism stitched together by prayer, endurance, and frost. Tsar Mikhail's court, once austere, began to hum with quiet purpose. Blacksmiths hammered iron for plows instead of swords. Bells rang again over the monasteries that had been silent through years of chaos. The scent of pine resin and candle wax filled the corridors of the rebuilt Kremlin. Russia, bruised and breathless, was breathing again. But beneath the hymns of renewal lay the low rumble of fear. The nobles, the boyars, watched the young dynasty with eyes sharpened by ambition. Many had lost fortunes during the wars, and they whispered that the throne should serve them now. The Tsar, they said, was too gentle, too ruled by his mother and father. Patriarch Filaret, returning from his captivity, sensed it. He entered the Kremlin in white robes embroidered with gold, his beard streaked with silver and fire in his gaze. The city bowed. Russia needs iron, not tears, he said. We will build faith with law, and law with the sword. And so the first foundations of autocracy were laid. Filaret became the architect of power, Mikhail its reluctant heart. Together they forged a balance between mercy and might that would define the Romanovs for generations. Edicts spread through the provinces, parchment sealed with crimson wax, bearing the double-headed eagle. Taxes were standardized. The church reaffirmed its dominion. Peasants bound to their land found that freedom had turned to frost beneath their feet. At night torches lined the walls of the Kremlin, like a crown of fire. Inside, the Tsar's private chapel glowed with candlelight. Icons shimmered in gold leaf, Christ Pantocrator gazing down on the kneeling monarch. In the stillness, Mikhail's whispered prayers echoed, "Let this crown never divide my soul." But crowns always do. The young dynasty's survival depended on unity and fear. The nobles were pacified not by trust, but by titles and marriages. Dissenters were exiled to Siberia, where wind and wolves kept silent company. Slowly power coalesced not around the throne, but within it. By the late 1630s, Russia's borders had expanded again. Fortresses rose along the Oka and Volga. Messengers rode east with banners, bearing the Romanov crest. Each mile conquered felt like a heartbeat returning to a wounded body. Yet every new victory carried the weight of old scars. One chronicler described those years as a dawn that refused to become day. The people adored Mikhail, not for what he achieved, but for what he endured. They saw in him a reflection of themselves, quiet suffering, patient faith. He was called the kind Tsar, a ruler who forgave rebels, spared enemies, and wept for widows. But kindness, in the language of empires, is often mistaken for frailty. When plague struck Moscow in 1629, panic spread faster than prayer. The streets emptied, corpses lay beneath snowdrifts. From his chamber window, Mikhail watched priests drag incense burners through the fog, their chants rising with the smoke. He refused to flee. "A shepherd does not abandon his flock," he said. And when the pestilence passed, his name was spoken with reverence and fear. For some believed only divine favor could have spared him. The myth of sacred kingship had taken root. By the time of his death, Russia had transformed. The boy who once trembled in a monastery had become a monarch forged by suffering. His funeral in 1645 drew mourners from every corner of the realm. The bells of the Dormition Cathedral tolled 13 times, once for each year of torment before his reign, once more for every decade of fragile peace he gave them. In the hush that followed, Patriarch Filaret's voice rang through the hall. From the ashes of sorrow, God made a crown. Yet even as incense curled toward the gilded dome, the patriarch knew the peace they had built rested on obedience, not harmony. The Romanovs had inherited a wounded kingdom and taught it to kneel. Someday it would remember how to rise. Outside the cathedral, snow began to fall again, soft, endless, inevitable. And somewhere in that white silence, a prophecy seemed to linger. Empires are not born of power alone. They are born of silence, and they die the same way. The century turned, and with it the pulse of Russia quickened. When Peter Alexeyevich Romanov was born in 1672, Few could imagine that this restless child, tall, curious, and uncontrollable, would drag his country into the modern age by sheer will. He was not yet Peter the Great. He was simply Peter, a boy chasing toy soldiers through the gardens of Izmailovo, his laughter echoing through the birch trees. But Russia was changing, and so was its destiny. The age of quiet faith that had nurtured Mikhail's reign was gone. In its place came iron fire and a hunger that could not be contained. Peter's childhood was a story of chaos and survival. The Kremlin had become a nest of rival factions, each scheming for power. When he was just 10, a bloody uprising, the Streltsy revolt, tore through Moscow. Armed guards stormed the palace. Courtiers were slaughtered in front of his eyes. Peter, terrified, hid in the shadows, clutching his half-brother's hand as screams echoed down the corridors. That day burned something into him, a hatred of stagnation and fear. In the years that followed, the boy grew into a man who could not sit still. He learned carpentry, shipbuilding, artillery, anything that turned thought into motion. His eyes blazed with ideas faster than his ministers could follow. "I am not made to live like a statue," he once said. "I was born to move." And move he did, through forests, through battlefields, across continents. Peter's reign began in 1682, but his true rule, his revolution, began in 1697, when he set sail westward, disguised as a common laborer. The Grand Embassy, it was called a journey through Europe to study the secrets of modern power. In the shipyards of the Netherlands, the Tsar of all Russia learned to saw timber and hammer nails. In England, he studied the structure of fleets and governments. In Prussia, he drilled with soldiers. Everywhere he went, he asked the same question: how does one make a nation great? The answer, he decided, lay not in prayer, but in progress. When he returned home 2 years later, Peter was no longer the boy who had fled from the rebels of Moscow. He was a storm, his beard trimmed in the Western style, his eyes sharp as bayonets. He demanded that Russia wake from its medieval sleep. He began by cutting, literally, beards, robes, traditions, privileges, all fell before his reforming blade. "Shave your beards," he ordered the nobles. "Let no man wear his grandfather's shadow." He introduced new schools, new uniforms, new laws. He created a navy where none had existed, forged a standing army of tens of thousands, and declared war on the Swedish Empire, one of the strongest forces in Europe. The Great Northern War would last 21 years. It was fought not only for territory, but for dignity. Russia's dream was to reach the sea, to open a window to the world, and Peter, the carpenter turned emperor, would carve that window himself, if he had to drown 1,000 men to do it. In 1703, he found the place a desolate swamp by the Baltic coast, where the Neva River met the sea. "Here," he declared, "we will build our window to Europe." The ground was waterlogged, the air thick with mosquitoes, and soldiers cursed as they dug foundations knee-deep in mud. Thousands died of disease, exhaustion, and cold, yet the work never stopped. Peter walked among them, sleeves rolled, shovel in hand. "We will make this city eternal," he told them, "and our grandchildren will thank us for our suffering." They called it St. Petersburg, his city, his monument. Within decades, it rose from the mire like a vision: marble palaces, golden spires, wide boulevards mirrored by canals. To the west it looked like a European masterpiece. To the east it looked like defiance itself. But for those who built it, it was a graveyard. One courtier whispered, "He built a city of stone, but laid its foundations in bone." Peter's empire stretched now from the Baltic to the Pacific. He founded the first Russian navy, established new industries, and reformed the church, stripping the patriarchate of its ancient power. The Tsar himself would be head of both state and faith. He reorganized society, forcing nobles to serve in military or government posts, ranking them by merit rather than birth. For the first time in Russian history, loyalty was rewarded more than lineage, but loyalty was measured by obedience. His court became a theater of power and spectacle. Foreign ambassadors marveled at the glittering balls in St. Petersburg, where Russian nobles waltzed awkwardly in French silk. Candles flickered off crystal chandeliers. Orchestras played under painted ceilings. It was a performance, Russia pretending to be Europe. Yet outside the gilded walls, the peasants' world remained unchanged. Fields frozen, taxes rising, sons conscripted. The empire was growing, but the people were breaking. Peter ruled with genius and cruelty in equal measure. He loved science and art, but he trusted fear more than love. He ordered public executions to remind the people of order. When his own son Alexei plotted against him, Peter showed no mercy. The boy was arrested, tortured, and condemned to die. In the dungeon of the Peter and Paul fortress, the emperor stood over his broken son. "You were my hope," Peter whispered, "and my betrayal." Alexei's death shattered him, but he never spoke of it again. For an empire built on discipline, weakness was the only unforgivable sin. When Peter the Great died in 1725, the empire he left behind was unrecognizable from the one he inherited. Russia had ships, armies, and a capital that rivaled Europe's greatest cities, but the cost was immeasurable, in blood, in freedom, in silence. The bells of St. Petersburg tolled across the Neva as his body lay in state, dressed in a naval uniform, a compass in his hand. Mourners filed past in awe. He had turned Russia toward the West, but the West had not yet turned toward Russia. One foreign diplomat wrote, "He forced his people to be great before they were ready," and perhaps he was right. For though Peter had given his empire glory, he had also given it fear, the fear of standing still. From that day forward, every Romanov who sat upon the throne would hear his ghost whispering, "Build, expand, conquer, or perish." But empires built on movement can never rest. Beyond the marble palaces of St. Petersburg, in the far corners of Siberia and the steppes, the next generation of rulers prepared to inherit not peace, but expectation. The Romanovs had become gods in their own land, untouchable, unquestioned, eternal. And yet, under the gilded ceilings of their new city, another kind of silence was beginning to grow, the silence of those who had paid the price. The age of fire and glory was ending. The age of doubt was coming. When the great Tsar's body was finally sealed within its marble tomb, the empire stood trembling, not with grief, but with awe. Peter the Great had been a storm, and now the air was still. Ministers whispered in candlelit corridors, uncertain who could rule after a man who had changed the very bones of Russia. The crown passed not to his blood, but to his will. His widow, Catherine War, a former servant and soldier's wife, was named Empress, the first woman ever to rule Russia. The nobles gasped, the priests protested, but none dared oppose the late Tsar's word. For even in death, Peter's shadow loomed across every hall. Catherine's reign was brief, only 2 years, but symbolic. The daughter of a peasant now wore the Romanov crown, proof that Peter's empire belonged not to lineage, but to power. She ruled with practicality and fear, guided by the same men who had served her husband, yet without Peter's will, the machinery of reform began to slow. The gears of empire, so long driven by one man's obsession, started to grind and creak. When she died in 1727, the throne passed to a child, Peter II, grandson of the great Tsar. The boy was sweet-natured, easily led, and wholly unprepared. Courtiers circled him like hawks, and before he could learn to rule, Smallpox carried him away. He was 15. It was as if fate itself was reminding the Romanovs the empire they had built demanded iron hearts, not fragile ones. From the ashes of the boy emperor's death rose another figure, Empress Anna the Bonhoff, niece of Peter the Great. She arrived from the remote duchy of Courland, where she had lived in lonely exile. The nobles welcomed her with forced smiles, and a list of conditions meant to limit her power. Anna read them once, then tore the parchment in half before the assembled court. "The Tsar's crown," she said coldly, "is not shared." With those words the autocracy was reborn. Anna ruled with an iron temperament and a taste for spectacle. Her court glittered with foreign architects, jesters, and soldiers. But behind the laughter and masquerades, her reign was one of icy cruelty. She built palaces while peasants starved. She created a court of ice, an entire palace carved from frozen water to celebrate a mock wedding. Guests shivered inside, until their laughter turned to trembling. Russia had entered its Baroque age, radiant on the surface, rotting underneath. After Anna's death, power passed like a fever from one Romanov to another. Ivan VI, a baby Tsar who ruled only in name, overthrown by Elizabeth, daughter of Peter the Great. Elizabeth ascended the throne, not through inheritance, but through courage. On a December night in 1740, she rode to the Winter Palace dressed in armor, her guards at her back. Bursting through the gilded doors, she declared to the stunned soldiers, "You know whose daughter I am, follow me." They did. Elizabeth's reign was a strange kind of return, not to Peter's severity, but to his dream of beauty and power. She rebuilt St. Petersburg, filled its palaces with art, and brought French culture to the Russian court. She was loved by the people for her laughter, and feared by her enemies for her temper. Under her rule, Russia's influence spread across Europe once more, in diplomacy, in war, and in grace. But every candle in her court cast a shadow. Behind her charm lay a truth she could not escape. She had no children, no heir of her own blood, and so she turned her gaze toward her nephew, a young German prince named Peter of Holstein-Gottorp. He was awkward, cruel, and careless, everything his great namesake was not. Yet through him, she hoped to preserve the Romanov name. By his side stood a woman who would one day eclipse them all, Sophia of Anhalt-Zerbst, a clever, ambitious princess who had changed her name to Catherine. Catherine watched, learned, and waited. When Elizabeth died in 1762, Peter III became emperor, and in 6 months lost everything. His strange admiration for Prussia, his insults toward the church, his neglect of the Russian army, all made him enemies faster than allies. Catherine, graceful and unreadable, smiled through it all. Then in the quiet of a summer night, she struck, riding through the streets of St. Petersburg in a green military uniform. She proclaimed herself Empress of Russia. The army cheered, the church blessed her, her husband fled, and within days he was dead. Thus began the reign of Catherine the Great, not by inheritance, but by will, fire, and blood. Under Catherine, Russia entered its golden age. She expanded the empire farther than any ruler before her, into the Crimea, the Caucasus, and Poland. She founded schools, hospitals, and academies. She corresponded with philosophers like Voltaire and Dubelov, bringing the Enlightenment to the frozen north. St. Petersburg gleamed brighter than ever, its marble palaces reflecting the aurora across the river. The Winter Palace became a world of silk, candlelight, and intrigue. Courtiers danced beneath ceilings painted with gods, while the Empress wrote laws and manifestos in her own hand. She saw herself not merely as a monarch, but as a builder of civilization. "I am not a woman," she once said. "I am the state." And yet, even in this age of light, the darkness beneath remained. The serfs still bent their backs in the fields, chained by poverty and decree. For all her reforms, Catherine could not free them. She feared the chaos that freedom might bring. A rebellion, she warned, is the wildest of storms. She was right. In 1773, the storm came. A man named Emelian Pugachev, a Cossack claiming to be the rightful Tsar, led tens of thousands of peasants and soldiers in revolt. They burned estates, looted cities, and hung noblemen from the gates they once guarded. For 2 years Russia burned. When the rebellion was finally crushed, Pugachev was brought to Moscow in an iron cage. Before the crowd, he smiled at the Empress's soldiers and said, "You may kill me, but the fire is not out." His head fell beneath the blade, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any victory. Catherine ruled for 34 years, longer than any Romanov before her. When she died in 1796, her empire stretched across 11 time zones. She had given Russia glory beyond measure, but beneath the gold leaf and grandeur, the same cracks widened: oppression, inequality, silence. A poet at her funeral whispered, "She gave us light, but we live in its shadow." The age of fire and glory had come to its magnificent end. Russia had been reborn, powerful, feared, and immense. Yet within its frozen heart, the same whisper returned: every empire built on suffering must someday answer for its splendor. And as the candles of Catherine's court burned low, a new century waited at the door, one that would not remember glory, but guilt. By the dawn of the 19th century, the Russian Empire gleamed like a jewel in the crown of Europe. St. Petersburg shimmered under pale northern light, palaces reflected on frozen canals, gilded domes blazing against the snow. From the Baltic to the Pacific, the Romanovs reigned as living gods. And yet, beneath all that gold, the earth trembled. The empire was vast, too vast for one family's will. 20 million serfs toiled in frozen fields, bound to the land like roots that could not move. They belonged not to themselves, but to their masters, men who could sell them, trade them, or send them to die in distant wars. In the candlelit halls of the Winter Palace, the nobles danced, their silks rustling like whispers. Outside, in the dark beyond the gates, the wind carried other voices, rougher, hungrier, angrier. Russia's power was unquestioned, its faith unshakable, but its soul was beginning to fracture. When Alexander I took the throne in 1801, hope returned, fragile and trembling. He was young, handsome, and spoke of change. "We must bring light to the darkness," he told his council. He dreamed of reform, of freeing the serfs, modernizing the government, softening the iron hand his ancestors had forged. But light cannot enter an empire built on shadows. The old guard, the generals, the clergy, the aristocrats, saw his ideals as heresy. "The Tsar is an angel," they whispered, "but angels do not rule men." And so Alexander wavered. The dream of freedom faded, replaced by fear of what freedom might bring. Then came Napoleon. The French emperor swept across Europe like a storm, crowning himself with fire. In 1812, his armies invaded Russia, 600,000 men marching toward Moscow beneath banners of conquest. Alexander faced him not with pride, but with patience. "We will retreat," he told his generals. "Let the land fight for us." And the land did. Napoleon's army advanced through smoke and snow, burning villages as they went. When they reached Moscow, they found it empty, its people gone, its treasures vanished, its silence heavy as judgment. Then, one by one, the city's buildings burst into flame. For days the capital burned. The sky turned crimson, the bells melted in their towers, and when the flames died, the French found nothing but ashes. Napoleon retreated. Winter came, merciless, unending. By the time his army stumbled home, only a handful remained alive. Russia had survived not by victory, but by endurance. And Alexander became the savior of Europe. The Tsar rode into Paris in triumph, hailed as the conqueror who had defeated the conqueror. In his carriage, he passed under arches of laurel, surrounded by cheering crowds, but his eyes, pale and distant, saw none of it. He had looked into the abyss and found no glory there. When he returned home, he was no longer the reformer or the hero. He was a ghost. He built churches, retreated into faith, and whispered that he would abdicate. Then one winter morning, in 1825, he vanished. Officially he died of fever, but rumors spread that he had fled into exile as a monk, wandering the Siberian wilderness in repentance for the blood he had shed. Whether true or not, the legend fit the mood of the empire, beautiful, tragic, and haunted. After him came Nicholas I, a soldier king born of iron. Where Alexander had dreamed, Nicholas commanded. His rule began with rebellion, the Decembrist revolt, led by officers who demanded a constitution. It was a bitter morning on Senate Square. Snow fell like ash as soldiers faced their own comrades, refusing to swear allegiance to a man they saw as tyranny reborn. Nicholas stood before them, cold and still, as cannon fire ripped through the air. When the smoke cleared, the snow was red. The new Tsar's message was clear. Mercy was weakness. He ruled as both father and jailer, his empire a fortress of discipline. Railways were built, universities censored, books burned. He called himself the gendarme of Europe. In his study, he once told a minister, "I prefer to be feared than loved. Love fades, fear endures. And yet fear has its own cracks." In 1853, Nicholas plunged his empire into the Crimean War, a struggle for faith and pride against the Ottoman Empire and its Western allies. The world's mightiest armies met on the Black Sea coast, and Russia's illusion of invincibility began to unravel. The war exposed the truth. Beneath the uniforms and hymns, Russia was still a medieval giant, vast, powerful, and slow. Soldiers fought with courage, but without shoes. Cannons rusted. Supply lines collapsed. When Sevastopol fell, Nicholas could not bear the shame. He died in 1855, some said of pneumonia, others of heartbreak. The bells of St. Isaac's Cathedral tolled in mourning. The empire that once burned Napoleon's armies now burned under its own weight. His son Alexander II inherited a land exhausted and divided, and he tried to heal it. Where his father ruled with fists, Alexander ruled with hands open. "It is better to abolish serfdom from above," he declared, "than to wait for it to abolish itself from below." In 1861, he signed the Emancipation Manifesto, freeing more than 20 million serfs. Church bells rang, peasants wept, and for a moment it seemed Russia might finally awaken. But freedom, like fire, is hard to control. The newly freed peasants found themselves burdened with taxes and debts. The land they received was small, the prices high, their chains were gone, but the hunger remained. And as hope turned to anger, the first whispers of revolution took root. In the cafes of St. Petersburg, students read forbidden books, poets wrote verses that burned like prayers. Secret societies met by candlelight, their voices low but their hearts loud. One woman, Vera Zazelich, wrote in her journal, "We were told freedom had come. Then we looked around, and saw the same walls, only painted gold. The empire glittered on the surface, but beneath the ground trembled." In 1881, as Alexander II rode through the streets in his carriage, a bomb exploded. Smoke filled the air, blood spattered the snow. The Tsar, bleeding and broken, was carried back to the palace where he died. Moments later, the liberator slain by those who demanded more liberty. His son, Alexander III, saw the ruin his father's compassion had brought and swore never to repeat it. He crushed dissent, exiled revolutionaries, and ruled with silence. Yet beneath his stern exterior was the same fear that haunted every Romanov, that mercy would be mistaken for weakness. He built cathedrals, strengthened the police, and filled prisons with dreamers. He believed Russia's salvation lay in unity, obedience, and faith. Where one Tsar dies, another must stand, he said, or Russia will fall. And for a time it worked. The empire glittered once again, its trains ran faster, its cities swelled, its palaces gleamed, but a cage of gold is still a cage. In 1894, the crown passed to Nicholas II, a gentle, hesitant man in an unforgiving world. He adored his wife Alexandra and dreamed of being a good father more than a great ruler. But history does not forgive hesitation. He inherited a kingdom that looked eternal but was cracking beneath the weight of its own splendor. Factories groaned with unrest, workers starved, soldiers whispered rebellion. The empire was a house of mirrors, dazzling, endless, and fragile. In ballrooms the nobility danced to orchestras, while beyond the palace walls, children begged for bread. The chandeliers sparkled like stars over a dying world. Every waltz hid a ticking clock, and the hands of that clock were moving faster. The Romanovs had built their golden cage, a world so magnificent it blinded them to the storm outside. As the century closed, the winds of revolution began to stir, cold and unstoppable. And within the palace, the last Tsar held his newborn son, unaware that both boy and empire were already bound by fate. The music of the court played on, soft and glittering, as Russia's silence deepened into prophecy. The empire no longer burned with fire or shone with glory. Now it shimmered, beautifully, fatally in gold. The last Tsar of Russia was born into light. Nicholas Alexandrovich Romanov entered the world in 1868, within the gilded chambers of Tsarskoye Selo, his cradle carved from silver, his lullabies sung by servants, who bowed before even touching his garments. He grew up surrounded by portraits of saints and emperors, tutored to believe that his family's rule was chosen not by man, but by God. But destiny has a way of mistaking crowns for shackles. By the time Nicholas ascended the throne in 1894, the empire his ancestors built was already trembling. The people adored him at first, a young, handsome Tsar who prayed each morning and kissed his wife's hand at every greeting. Yet behind the gentleness lay uncertainty. He once confided in his journal, "I am not prepared to rule. I never wanted to be Tsar." But fate had chosen him, and Russia demanded not a man, but a myth. His coronation in Moscow was meant to be a festival of faith and unity. Bells rang across the city, incense filled the air, and thousands gathered in Kadinka Field for a celebration. The crowd surged forward, desperate for food, gifts, and tokens bearing the Tsar's image. The joy turned to panic. When the stampede ended, more than 1,000 people lay dead, crushed beneath the boots of their fellow subjects. That night, Nicholas attended a royal ball, as if nothing had happened. The people began to whisper, "The Tsar is blessed, but not touched." From that moment, a gulf widened between ruler and ruled, one that no crown could bridge. In the years that followed, Nicholas's empire strained under the weight of its own contradictions. The world was changing, machines roared, cities swelled, ideas spread faster than soldiers could silence them. But in Russia time moved differently. The peasants still knelt to icons, the nobles still toasted to eternity. Then came the Russo-Japanese War, a humiliation born of pride. Nicholas, urged by his ministers, sent his fleets east to claim dominance in the Pacific. The world expected a swift victory. Instead, Russia's ships were sunk, its armies shattered. The news spread like smoke. Mothers wept for sons who would never return. The people's faith in divine monarchy began to fade. How, they asked, Can God's chosen ruler lose to men who do not even worship him? Rebellion sparked in the streets. In 1905, St. Petersburg erupted. Protesters carrying icons and portraits of the Tsar marched toward the Winter Palace, not with weapons but with petitions. They sought mercy, bread, reform. They were met with gunfire. Cossacks rode into the crowd, sabers flashing. The snow turned red. It was Bloody Sunday, the day Russia's faith in its father died. One witness wrote, "We went to meet our Tsar, and instead we met death." From that day forward, Nicholas was no longer the little father. He was Nicholas the Bloody. To calm the storm, the Tsar offered reforms, a parliament, a constitution, a promise of progress. The Duma was born, but its power was a mirage. Whenever it disagreed with him, Nicholas dissolved it. "I will not share my crown," he declared. Meanwhile, underground newspapers spread like wildfire. Workers organized strikes, revolutionaries plotted in shadows. The empire pulsed with tension, too modern to be silent, too ancient to change. In the royal chambers, the Tsarina, Alexandra Fyodorovna, prayed beside a child's bed. Her son Alexei, the heir to the throne, had been born with hemophilia, a disease that made even a small wound a mortal threat. The boy's illness became the empire's secret. Every bruise, every drop of blood, was a national crisis. Nicholas ruled a country he could not control, and a household he could not heal. Then came the man who promised he could. He arrived without warning, a wandering monk from Siberia, unwashed, unholy, yet somehow holy, Grigory Rasputin. He claimed he could ease the boy's pain, and somehow miraculously he did. When Alexei bled, Rasputin prayed, and the bleeding stopped. Science could not explain it. Faith could not ignore it. To the Tsarina, he was a savior. To the court, he was a serpent. Soon, Rasputin's influence reached beyond the sick room. He whispered advice on ministers, wars, even the Tsar's decrees. His name spread through the salons of St. Petersburg like poison in wine. Pamphlets accused him of debauchery, drunkenness, heresy, but Alexandra defended him with a mother's desperation. "He alone brings peace to our son." As Rasputin's shadow lengthened, so did the people's anger. "The throne," they murmured, "is ruled by a madman, and the madman is ruled by a monk." Then, as if drawn by fate, came the Great War. In 1914, the guns of Europe thundered, and Russia marched once more into the storm. Trains filled with soldiers left for battles they would never win. Villages emptied of men. Mothers kissed sons goodbye on platforms dusted with snow. Nicholas rode out in uniform, blessing the troops, his face calm, his heart uncertain. "God will not abandon Holy Russia," he said. But even God seemed tired. The war devoured everything: food, fuel, faith. Millions died. The front lines became graves. The factories behind them became tombs. By 1916, the empire was starving. Bread lines stretched for miles. Winter bit deeper each year. And in the palaces, chandeliers still burned, their crystals trembling with the echo of distant gunfire. In December that year, a conspiracy formed among nobles who claimed they would save Russia by saving the Tsar from himself. They lured Rasputin to a palace on the Moika River, fed him poisoned wine, shot him, beat him, and finally drowned him beneath the ice. His body was found days later, frozen with eyes open, as if still watching. When Alexandra heard the news, she collapsed. "You have killed the holy man," she wept. "Now you will kill us all." Her words would prove prophetic. By early 1917, the empire began to collapse from within. Strikes spread through Petrograd. Soldiers joined the protesters. Barricades rose in the streets. For the first time in centuries, the people no longer feared the crown. "Your Majesty," one minister warned, "the ground itself is cracking. But Nicholas did not listen. He was hundreds of miles away, commanding troops who no longer believed. When he finally boarded the train back to the capital, it was too late. The empire he ruled existed only on paper. On March 2nd, 1917, the Tsar signed his abdication, his name written with a trembling hand. "May God have mercy on Russia," he said softly. Outside, church bells rang, not in celebration, not in mourning, but in disbelief. 300 years of Romanov rule had ended with a signature and silence. Nicholas and his family were placed under arrest. They were sent first to their palace at Tsarskoye Selo, then to Tobolsk, then to Yekaterinburg, deeper and deeper into the heart of the country that had turned against them. Even in captivity, they clung to grace. They prayed, wrote letters, sang hymns. Their guards, at first respectful, began to mock them. One night, a soldier cut the imperial crest from Alexandra's chair and laughed. Still, Nicholas wrote in his diary, "I have faith in God's mercy. Whatever comes, we shall endure it together." But mercy by then had left Russia. In July 1918, the family was awakened before dawn. They were told they would be moved to a safer location. The Tsar dressed in his uniform. The Tsar's Rena gathered her children. They descended into the cellar of the Apateyev house, a narrow whitewashed room, lit by a single bulb. Moments later, a group of men entered. Nicholas turned to them calmly. "What is happening?" he asked. One man stepped forward, raised his pistol, and said, "Your relatives have tried to save you. We must now do what they could not." The gunfire began. When it ended, the room was still. The last echo of the Romanovs, the prayers, the laughter, the empire vanished into silence. Outside, the city slept beneath a grey sky. The bells of Yekaterinburg were silent that morning. No one sang, no one prayed. In the West, the war was ending. In Russia, it was only beginning. A new war between red and white, faith and hunger, memory and oblivion. The palaces stood empty, their chandeliers still glimmering faintly, as if the ghosts of the past refused to leave. The dynasty that had ruled for 300 years ended not in fire, nor in glory, but in silence. A silence that still hangs, heavy and holy, over the snow. Dawn came softly over the Ural mountains. The air was pale and cold, the earth still wet from the night's rain. In the quiet town of Yekaterinburg, smoke drifted lazily from chimneys, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But inside a cellar, history had ended. The Romanovs were gone. No fanfare, no ceremony, only a shallow pit in the forest, and the whisper of shovels in the dark. The soldiers who buried them said nothing. They worked quickly, their faces blank, their breaths clouding the night. One paused to cross himself, then stopped halfway, uncertain what God to pray to anymore. Another muttered, "May they forgive us." But forgiveness was a luxury that Russia no longer understood. Above the trees, a thin mist rose, curling through the birch branches like smoke from an invisible fire. It was as if the empire itself were exhaling, one final exhausted breath. When news of the Tsar's death reached Moscow, there was no announcement, no mourning, no public cry, only a quiet acknowledgement, whispered from office to office, "It's done." The revolution had no room for saints or symbols. To the new leaders, the Romanovs were relics of a disease that had to be cured. To the people, they were ghosts, distant, tragic, unreal. And so, an empire that had once covered a sixth of the earth disappeared not with the roar of cannons, but with the turning of a page. 300 years of monarchy dissolved overnight into slogans and suspicion. The double-headed eagle was torn from buildings, icons were smashed, the palaces were looted, their marble halls echoing with the footsteps of guards who did not understand the splendor they destroyed. In one, a worker found a child's toy, a small wooden horse with faded blue paint. He turned it over in his calloused hands and said softly, "They were just people, after all." But Russia was not ready to remember them as people. Not yet. Outside the cities, the civil war began, brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor. The Reds fought for revolution, the Whites fought for the memory of the old world, and between them the land itself bled. Villages were burned, trains derailed, hunger spread like winter wind. In the ruins of the countryside, peasants prayed to saints whose names they no longer dared to speak. In Petrograd, no longer St. Petersburg, the streets were silent. The Winter Palace stood gutted, its windows broken, its chandeliers dark. Once the halls had glowed with candlelight and waltzes. Now rats scurried where courtiers once bowed. A guard posted at the gates wrote home to his wife, "They told us this was victory. But when I walk through these rooms, I feel only ghosts. The ghosts of Russia's past, of Mikhail, of Peter, of Catherine, of Nicholas, seem to linger, watching as the empire they had built turned to dust." In 1924, Lenin's body was placed in a glass tomb on Red Square, the new symbol of a nation reborn through revolution. Outside, the snow fell softly, covering the footprints of those who came to see him. The same land that once crowned emperors now embalmed revolutionaries. The old faith was replaced with a new one, not of God but of ideology. Where once stood the icons of saints, now stood portraits of men in grey coats. Where once the priests had whispered prayers, now the party whispered slogans. But beneath it all, the silence remained. The same silence that had followed the Romanovs into the earth. Decades passed. Wars came and went. Cities burned and were rebuilt. The world changed its flags and maps, but Russia's soul remained the same, vast, mournful, unyielding. In secret, old women lit candles for the lost Tsar. In villages untouched by progress, stories passed from mouth to mouth that the royal children had survived, that one had escaped, that the empire would rise again. Hope, it seemed, was harder to bury than flesh. And then, in 1991, 73 years after the gunfire in Yekaterinburg, the empire that replaced the Romanovs collapsed as quietly as they had. The Soviet Union fell, its red banners lowered in silence. In the end, the new world died much like the old one, not in fire but in exhaustion. History, it seemed, had learned nothing but repetition. When the remains of Nicholas II and his family were finally discovered in a shallow forest grave, the earth around them was still soft, almost tender. Scientists worked in silence, brushing away the soil, piecing together bones that once wore crowns. In 1998, their bodies were brought back to St. Petersburg. For the first time in 80 years, the bells of the Peter and Paul Cathedral rang for the Romanovs. Crowds gathered in the rain. Some wept openly, others stood in solemn stillness. The coffins were lined in white, each marked with a cross. Inside the cathedral, a choir sang the same hymns that had echoed centuries before, when another Romanov, Mikhail, the first Tsar, had been crowned. As the priest raised his voice in prayer, it was as though the empire itself were being given its last rites. One journalist wrote that day, "They were buried twice, once in darkness, once in light." And perhaps that was the truest legacy of the Romanovs. Not their palaces, not their wars, not their wealth, but their silence. A silence that outlasted power, politics, and time. Because every empire, no matter how vast, is built not just on glory, but on memory, and memory cannot be killed. Today, St. Petersburg shines again, its canals glittering under the northern sun. Tourists walk through the Winter Palace, their footsteps echoing on marble floors, where empresses once danced. They admire the chandeliers, the paintings, the gold, but few notice the cold that still lingers in the air. In a corner of the Hermitage, near a window overlooking the Neva, A small plaque bears the names of Nicholas II, Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei. No grand monument, no marble statues, just names. It is enough, because in the end, history does not whisper through crowns or thrones. It whispers through the names we remember, and the silences we cannot forget. The House of Romanov was not the first dynasty to fall, nor the last, but it remains one of the few whose story reads like a prayer, beautiful, broken, and unanswered. For 300 years they believed they were chosen by heaven. For one night in July, they learned that heaven had gone quiet, and when the guns fell silent, all that remained was the snow, falling softly over Russia, covering the graves and closing the empire's eyes forever.